She left her home on an ordinary Wednesday night, driving a coworker to the hospital for what should have been a simple emergency. But somewhere between the parking lot and the entrance, Dorothy Jane Scott vanished into darkness. Her car was found hours later engulfed in flames, and then for 4 years her family's phone would ring. The voice on the other end was always the same. "I've got her," he would say. "I killed her." And then silence. This is a true story. This is the case of Dorothy Jane Scott. Welcome to the Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross. Before we begin tonight's investigation, I need to ask something of you. We're building something here, a community of people who refuse to let these stories fade into obscurity. We're pushing toward 100 subscribers, and every single person who joins us matters. If you believe these cases deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button now. We need you here. And before we go further, I want to know something. Where are you watching from right now? What corner of the world has brought you to this story tonight? Drop a comment below. Tell me your city, your country. I want to see how far these files travel. How many people across this planet are listening in the dark, just like Dorothy's family once did, waiting for answers that never came? Now, if this story moves you, if it unsettles you the way it should, do me a favor. Give this video a like. We're aiming for 20 likes on this one. 20 people willing to say, yes, this matters, yes, I was here. It seems small, but it tells me you're listening. It tells me you care. So hit that like button and let's descend into one of the most psychologically disturbing cases California has ever known. This is the story of a woman who lived in fear, who vanished in seconds, and whose tormentor refused to let her rest even in death. This is the Dorothy Jane Scott case. In 1980, Southern California was a place of contradictions. The sun-soaked streets of Orange County painted a picture of suburban tranquility, but beneath that golden surface, darkness had a way of seeping through. Stanton, California, was one of those unremarkable towns where everyone knew their neighbors, where children played in cul-de-sacs until the streetlights came on, and where a single mother could raise her son in relative peace. Dorothy Jane Scott was 32 years old that year, living with her 4-year-old boy Sean and her aunt in a modest home that smelled of home-cooked meals and fresh laundry. She was, by all accounts, a woman of routine, a devout Christian who attended church regularly, who didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't dabble in the vices that defined the era for so many others. She was careful, she was cautious, and she was terrified. Dorothy worked as a secretary, tucked away in the back office of 2 jointly owned businesses in Anaheim, Swinger's Psych Shop and Custom John's Head Shop. The names alone painted a picture, didn't they? These were establishments that catered to the counterculture crowd, places where incense hung thick in the air and tie-dye was a uniform. For a woman like Dorothy, conservative and grounded in her faith, it seemed like an odd fit. But her father, Jacob Scott, was a co-owner, and family loyalty ran deep. So she took the job, stayed in the back room, typed invoices, answered phones, and kept her head down. She rarely interacted with the clientele. She didn't need to. Her world was small, manageable, predictable, or at least it had been. Months before that terrible night in May, something changed. The phone at her desk began to ring with a frequency that unsettled her. At first, the calls were innocuous enough that she might have dismissed them as wrong numbers or pranks. But they persisted, and they evolved. The voice on the other end was male, calm, deliberate. It was a voice Dorothy told her mother sounded familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. And that familiarity made it all the more disturbing, because whoever this man was, he knew her. He knew her routines, her habits, the exact clothes she wore on any given day. He knew where she parked her car, what time she left work. When she picked up her son from daycare, he was watching, always watching. The content of the calls oscillated between 2 extremes, and that duality was perhaps the most chilling aspect of all. One moment, the voice would be tender, almost reverent. "I love you, Dorothy," he would say, as though they shared some secret intimacy. And then, without warning, the tone would shift. The tenderness would curdle into rage. "I'll cut you into pieces," he would hiss. "No one will ever find you." The whiplash was intentional, a calculated method of control. He wanted her afraid. He wanted her confused. He wanted her to know that no matter what she did, he was there lurking just beyond her line of sight. And then came the rose. Dorothy arrived at work one morning to find her white Toyota station wagon parked exactly where she'd left it the night before. But something was different. Resting on the windshield, wilted and brown, was a single dead rose. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. This wasn't a gesture of affection. It was a warning. It was a promise. He had been there, in the parking lot, in the dark, close enough to touch her car, close enough to touch her. When the phone rang later that day, the voice confirmed what she already knew. "Did you like my gift?" he asked. Dorothy didn't respond. What could she say? She confided in her parents, Vera and Jacob. They urged her to go to the police, but what could law enforcement do? The calls were untraceable. The man never identified himself. There was no direct threat she could point to, no evidence beyond her own mounting dread. So Dorothy took matters into her own hands. She considered buying a firearm, but the idea didn't sit well with her. She wasn't a violent person. She didn't want to live in a world where she had to be. Instead, she enrolled in karate lessons, hoping that if the moment ever came, she could defend herself. She tried to carry on, to maintain the facade of normalcy for Sean, for her family, for herself. But by May of 1980, Dorothy Jane Scott was a woman living on the edge of a precipice, and she knew it. She could feel it. The question wasn't if something would happen, it was when. The night of May 28th began unremarkably. Dorothy was attending an employee meeting at the shop, the kind of routine gathering that every workplace endures. Discussions about inventory, schedules, the mundane mechanics of keeping a business running. But during the meeting, Dorothy noticed something. Her coworker, Conrad Bostron, looked ill. His face was pale, his movement sluggish, and on his arm was an angry, swollen mark, red and inflamed. A spider bite, though at the time, no one was certain. It looked bad. Bad enough that Dorothy, ever the caretaker, offered to drive him to the emergency room. Another co-worker, Pam Head, agreed to come along. It was a simple act of kindness, the kind of decision made without a second thought. But that decision would alter the course of everything. Before heading to the hospital, Dorothy made a stop. She drove to her parents' home to check on Sean, to make sure he was settled for the night. While she was there, she did something small, something insignificant in the moment, but crucial in hindsight. She changed her scarf. She'd been wearing a black one earlier in the evening, but she swapped it for a red one. A flash of color against the California night. No one would have remembered that detail except for the fact that later, someone else would. Someone who had no business knowing. The three of them arrived at UCI Medical Center in Orange just after 9 o'clock. The emergency room was busy, as emergency rooms always are. A fluorescent-lit purgatory of waiting and worry. Conrad was taken back relatively quickly, and after being examined, he was given a prescription to fill at the hospital pharmacy. While he waited for the medication, Dorothy made an offer. "I'll bring the car around," she said. It made sense. Why make Conrad, already feeling terrible, walk through the sprawling parking lot when she could simply drive to the entrance? Pam stayed with Conrad. Dorothy walked out into the night alone. The parking lot was dark, the kind of sprawling, poorly lit expanse that hospitals seem to favor. Rows and rows of vehicles, shadows pooling between them. Dorothy's white 1973 Toyota station wagon was parked somewhere in that maze. She had her keys in her hand. She walked with purpose, the way people do when they're alone in a place that feels just a little too empty. And then she was gone. Pam and Conrad waited at the entrance. 5 minutes passed, then 10. They stood under the harsh lights, scanning the lot for the familiar shape of Dorothy's car. And then they saw it. The white station wagon came tearing toward them, high beams blazing, so bright they had to shield their eyes. The car wasn't slowing down, it wasn't pulling up to the curb, it was moving fast, erratically, swerving through the parking lot like something pursued. Pam and Conrad barely had time to process what they were seeing before the car veered away from them entirely, speeding out of the medical center complex and disappearing into the night. They assumed Dorothy had received an emergency call about Sean. Why else would she leave like that? They waited a little longer, confused. before eventually finding another ride home. They thought they'd hear from her the next day. They didn't. At approximately 4:30 in the morning, a call came in to the Santa Ana Fire Department. A vehicle was on fire in an alley, flames consuming it with a ferocity that suggested accelerant had been used. Firefighters arrived to find Dorothy's white Toyota station wagon fully engulfed, the paint blistering, the windows shattered from the heat. By the time they extinguished the blaze, the car was a charred skeleton. Inside, there was nothing. No body, no blood, no sign of Dorothy Jane Scott. The car had been found roughly 10 miles from the hospital, abandoned and set alight in a location that suggested the person who left it there knew the area well. But Dorothy herself had simply vanished. When Dorothy didn't come home that night, when she didn't call, when the morning came and went without a word, her family knew something was catastrophically wrong. This wasn't like her. Dorothy was responsible, meticulous, the kind of mother who would never leave her son wondering where she was. Vera and Jacob contacted the police immediately, but the response was muted. Adults go missing all the time, they were told. Give it a few days, she'll probably turn up. But her family knew better. They knew about the calls. They knew about the fear Dorothy had been living with. And they knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in their stomachs, that whoever had been tormenting her had finally made good on his promises. The investigation began, but it moved slowly, hampered by a lack of physical evidence and an overworked police department. Detectives interviewed Pam and Conrad, trying to piece together the timeline. Why had Dorothy driven away so recklessly? Who had been behind the wheel? The two co-workers were adamant that they couldn't see the driver. The high beams had blinded them. All they knew was that the car was moving fast and that Dorothy was supposed to be driving it. But was she? Or had someone else already taken control? The discovery of the burned car raised more questions than it answered. If someone had taken Dorothy, why destroy the vehicle? Was it an attempt to eliminate evidence? Or was it a message, a final act of control, a way of saying, she's mine now, and there's nothing you can do about it? The car was processed, but the fire had done its job. Any forensic evidence that might have been inside was ash. And then, about 2 weeks after Dorothy disappeared, the phone rang at the Orange County Register. Pat Riley, an editor at the paper, picked up. The voice on the other end was male, steady, almost clinical in its delivery. "I ended her life," the man said. "I ended Dorothy Scott's life. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I ended her." Riley, thinking it might be a crank call, was about to hang up when the man continued. He offered proof, details that hadn't been released to the public. He knew about the spider bite on Conrad's arm. He knew that Dorothy had been wearing a red scarf that night, the one she'd only put on at her parents' house. Information that only someone who had been there, watching, waiting, could possibly know. Riley immediately contacted the police, and the call was traced as far as it could be, but it led nowhere. The man had called from a payphone, and by the time authorities arrived, he was long gone. But the call did one thing. It confirmed what Dorothy's family had feared from the beginning. She hadn't run away. She hadn't left voluntarily. Someone had taken her, and he wanted everyone to know it. If you're still with me, if this case is pulling you in the way it should, I need you to do something. Share this video, send it to someone who needs to hear this story. Post it, spread it. These cases survive because people like you refuse to let them be forgotten. Dorothy's voice was silenced, but ours doesn't have to be. Share this. Let the world know what happened to her. What followed over the next 4 years was a campaign of psychological torture, so sustained, so methodical, that it defies comprehension. Almost every Wednesday, like clockwork, the phone would ring in the Scott household. Vera would answer, her hand trembling every time she picked up the receiver because she knew. She always knew. "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" the voice would ask. And Vera, unable to stop herself, would say yes. And then the man would deliver his message. Sometimes it was simple. "I've got her." Other times, it was more direct. "I ended her life." And then he would hang up. The calls were always brief, never lasting more than a few seconds, just long enough to reopen the wound, but not long enough for police to trace. The phone line was tapped. Authorities were standing by. But the man was careful. He knew exactly how long he could stay on the line before the trace would complete. He was always one step ahead. For Vera, those calls became a weekly ritual of agony. Every Wednesday she would brace herself, knowing that the phone might ring, knowing that she would hear that voice again. And every time it happened, she was powerless. She couldn't stop him. She couldn't find him. All she could do was listen as this stranger taunted her with the knowledge that her daughter was gone and that he was responsible. Jacob would sit beside her, helpless, watching his wife endure this torment week after week, month after month, year after year. They couldn't change their number. What if Dorothy called? What if there was news? So they stayed, and they suffered. And then, in April of 1984, something changed. The phone rang, but this time Jacob answered. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a beat of silence, and then the man hung up. He didn't speak. He didn't deliver his usual message. He just hung up, and he never called again. That abrupt cessation sparked theories. Did the man know Jacob? Was he afraid that Jacob would recognize his voice, or had something else happened, something that made him stop? No one knows, but the calls ended that night, leaving the Scott family in a silence that was almost as unbearable as the torment had been. 4 months later, in August of 1984, construction workers were clearing brush off Santa Ana Canyon Road when they stumbled upon something that made them stop. Bones, human bones, scattered in the dirt about 30 feet off the road, tangled in thick undergrowth. The remains were skeletal, bleached by the sun and damaged by a brush fire that had swept through the area 2 years earlier. But there were identifiers: a turquoise ring, a watch. The watch had stopped at 12:32 in the morning on May 29, 1980, roughly an hour after Dorothy had walked into that parking lot and disappeared. Dental records were compared. The skull was Dorothy's. Her remains had been there all along, less than 20 miles from her home, hidden in plain sight. The fire had destroyed much of the surrounding tissue, making it impossible to determine a cause of death. There were no obvious signs of trauma to the bones, no bullet holes, no fractures that would indicate a struggle. But that didn't mean she hadn't suffered. It just meant that whatever happened to her left no mark that time could preserve. Strangely, the bones of a dog were found on top of her remains. Some speculated that the man who took her had placed them there deliberately, a macabre attempt to mask the scent or deter discovery. Others believed it was coincidence, that a stray animal had simply died in the same spot. No one knows. When the news broke that Dorothy's remains had been found, the Scott family received one final call. The voice asked, "Is Dorothy home?" And then, silence. He never called again. That question, so simple and so cruel, was his last word on the matter, a reminder that even in death, he still held power over her story. The investigation intensified after the discovery, but leads were scarce. Detectives combed through Dorothy's life, looking for anyone who fit the profile of an obsessive stalker. And one name kept coming up: Mike Butler. He was a regular at the shop where Dorothy worked, a man described by those who knew him as unstable, intense, and unnervingly fixated on Dorothy. His sister also worked at the shop, which gave him a reason to be there frequently, but his visits often felt like they had nothing to do with his sister. He would linger, watching Dorothy, trying to engage her in conversation, even when she clearly wanted to be left alone. Co-workers noticed, Dorothy noticed, but what could she do? Butler's name surfaced again and again during the investigation, but there was never enough evidence to charge him. No physical evidence linked him to the crime. No witness could definitively place him at the hospital that night. And Butler himself never confessed. He denied any involvement, and without proof, the case stalled. Years passed. Decades. Butler lived his life, never arrested, never charged. And in 2014, he passed away, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. Dorothy's son, Sean, now an adult, has publicly stated his belief that Butler was responsible. He spent his life living with the absence of his mother, and he wants answers. But answers, it seems, are the one thing this case refuses to provide. The profile of Dorothy's tormentor tells us certain things. He was methodical. He was patient. He had the time and resources to follow her, to watch her, to know intimate details about her daily life. He was likely someone who felt inadequate socially, someone who built an entire fantasy relationship with Dorothy in his mind, and when that fantasy didn't align with reality, when Dorothy didn't reciprocate feelings she didn't even know he had, he snapped. The calls to her family suggest someone who derived satisfaction from control, from knowing that even after taking her life, he could still inflict pain. That kind of sustained cruelty requires a specific psychology, one rooted in deep dysfunction and an inability to process rejection. But here's what haunts me most about this case. Dorothy did everything right. She recognized the danger. She told her family. She took self-defense classes. She was careful. And none of it mattered, because the person who targeted her was willing to wait, willing to watch, willing to follow her into a hospital parking lot on a random Wednesday night when she was just trying to help a sick coworker. There was no way for her to predict that moment, no way to prepare for it. And that randomness, that sheer unpredictability, is what makes this case so deeply unsettling. It reminds us that sometimes no amount of caution is enough. Sometimes the danger finds you anyway. If this story has affected you, if you found yourself holding your breath during certain moments, then do this for me. Leave a comment, tell me what you think happened. Tell me if you believe Butler was responsible, or if you think the real perpetrator is still out there, unknown and unnamed. I read every single comment. Your thoughts matter. Your theories matter. So share them. Let's keep this conversation alive, because that's how cases like this stay in the public consciousness. That's how pressure remains on the system to find answers, even decades later. Dorothy Jane Scott deserved better. She deserved to watch her son grow up. She deserved to live without fear. She deserved justice. And the fact that she received none of those things is a failure, not just of the system, but of all of us. Because we live in a world where women are stalked, terrorized, and taken, and we still ask, why didn't she do more to protect herself? Dorothy did everything she could. It wasn't enough, and that should enrage us. The case remains officially unsolved. The Orange County Sheriff's Department still lists it as open, though active investigation has long since ceased. Dorothy's family has never stopped searching for answers, but with each passing year, the likelihood of resolution diminishes. Witnesses age, memories fade, evidence degrades, and the person responsible, whether it was Butler or someone else entirely, may have already taken the truth with them into death. But here's what we can do. We can remember. We can refuse to let Dorothy's story disappear into the void of unsolved cases that pile up in dusty file rooms. We can speak her name. We can demand better from a system that too often dismisses the fears of women until it's too late. We can honor her memory by insisting that cases like this matter, that every victim deserves justice, and that no one should have to live in fear the way Dorothy did. This is the midnight file, and some files never close. They linger, they haunt, they demand to be reopened. Dorothy Jane Scott's file is one of them. If stories like this keep you awake at night, if they make you question the shadows a little more carefully, then subscribe. Because there are more files, more stories, more voices that need to be heard. And I'll be here in the dark waiting to share them with you. She walked into a parking lot on a warm May night, and the world swallowed her whole. 4 years of silence broken only by the cruel voice on the phone. A turquoise ring found in the dirt. A watch frozen at 12:32. And a son who grew up without his mother, left to wonder for the rest of his life what those final moments were like. What she felt. What she saw. Whether she called out for help that never came. Some questions don't have answers. Some files don't have endings. This is one of them. Until next time, I'm Julian Cross, and the file remains open.